Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about radical ideas, radical people, and radical stories at the intersection of ethics and artificial intelligence. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. In this episode, we interview the interdisciplinary research team of Calvin Liang, Jevan Hutson, and Os Keys. Calvin and Os are PhD students in human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington. Jevan is a data justice advocate, human-computer interaction researcher, and recent graduate of the University of Washington School of Law.
In this panel, we discuss the motivation and research behind their paper, Surveillance, Stigma, and Sociotechnical Design for HIV. This paper analyzes the approaches that 49 online dating and hookup platforms have taken when designing for HIV disclosure. Calvin, Jevan, and Os point to bottom-up, communal, and queer approaches for design as a way of potentially making the tension between disclosure and risk easier to safely navigate. Their paper will be published in First Monday's special issue on HIV and AIDS and digital media in the fall. We are grateful to these scholars for their important research and are excited to share our conversation with Calvin, Jevan, and Os with all of you.
All right, we are here today with Jevan Hutson, Calvin Liang, and Os Keys, and they are all the authors of the paper Surveillance, Stigma, and Sociotechnical Design for HIV. And Jevan's going to start us off by telling us what this paper is about.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having us, Jess. This paper sort of starts from sort of the really complicated position it is to sort of live with HIV in sort of the digital age. HIV is not only bound up in incredible amounts of individual, personal to structural discrimination and stigma, but also sits atop like a really torrid history of violence and particularly surveillance and criminalization. And as sort of HCI researchers, some of us with previous experience working on sort of dating platforms, intimate platform design, we're curious about sort of the ways in which dating platforms design for HIV, right? Like HIV is like I said, a complicated experience in the outside world and the digital world, but plays out particularly in the context of online dating and sort of digital intimacy. And as researchers, we've seen efforts on dating platforms to say afford individuals the ability to disclose their HIV status, and many of which were sort of taken as an attempt to, destigmatize, to otherwise begin a conversation and create opportunities for users to, discuss their status openly and in a way that doesn't, and sort of result in downstream discrimination. But in sort of our approach to this, we are obviously informed sort of by the critical history of HIV activism, but also the particularly pernicious role the state has played, right, in surveilling and incarcerating persons with HIV. And that's what sort of struck us in sort of the initial approach to like, look, folks are designing for HIV, is there was not a ton of attention to sort of the structural forces at play for folks with HIV. It's not just I'm on a dating platform, right, that I exist in sort of a network of other users who have my information, where that information can go, what it can do to me, how it might result in sort of maybe downstream prosecution or other sorts of issues, right, with sort of privacy on these platforms. So that's sort of how we get to this. And sort of the goal for our study was to take a look at a broad base of popular platforms to get a sense of what this HIV design work looks like, and try to think about, how that impacts issues of HIV surveillance, stigma, criminalization, and sort of reflecting on how we do sort of critical socio-technical design. And sort of from there, like one of our biggest takeaways is like, look, we're not designing to think about, we're not designing in a way that's sort of critical of the ways in which HIV exists in the world, particularly with respect to sort of medical legal infrastructures, HIV surveillance, criminalization. And our sort of goal is, we don't necessarily offer the solution, right, to how we navigate disclosure, stigma, surveillance, and criminalization, but rather point towards sort of critical design practices that is like, look, if we are going to design for HIV, if we're going to, make dating platforms work, whether that's through destigmatization or through disclosure, we need to be mindful of the other structures, particularly the state, and the ways in which private companies exist in operation with the state, with law enforcement, as well as public health authorities, right? So that we give greater autonomy and sort of dignity to folks with HIV. So we're not just, designing to destigmatize without recognizing that the state exists and we need to be cognizant of its, its consequences. And I guess I know you had said about sort of how we sort of personally relate to this work. I've been living with HIV for a number of years, and I think a lot of this comes out of my own sort of personal experience, right? With, do I disclose? Who's seeing whether I disclose? Who's going to use this information? Does Grindr have this information? Is it going to other people? How is this going to impact me, right? And it's just such a complicated balance in a space that's already complicated enough, right? Love is hard, right? Love and sex is hard, right? And these platforms, I think, afford all of these great new opportunities, but I think we sort of forget the sort of complex network that people exist in when we're designing for, sort of pro-social ends.
And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you all on the show as well, in addition to the fact that this is, based on what I've seen, like a fairly underrepresented I guess, academic pursuit. I haven't seen a lot of papers in the AI space looking at HIV or even dating platforms. And so I think that's just like such an important place for us to go into. And also some of the Twitter posts that you all posted when you were so excited that this article was published were taking that more personal route, which is why we wanted for you to talk about, like, kind of put a face to it, I guess, of like, why is this important that we talk about? Either from your personal experience or from the communities that you're interacting with.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in sort of bouncing off what I said before, like these, like we can sit as researchers, as academics, and sort of think about these problems in the abstract, but they play out, right? There are folks who have been, incarcerated because of their status, right? There are folks who have, suffered various forms of violence and sort of downstream privacy harms, right? And I can, I sit in a position of privilege, right? I have not been incarcerated, and frankly, like, the state does not look for me, right, for incarceration, right? I'm not a person of color living with HIV, right? There are other communities in which these practices play out, but I think it's sort of stepping back, whether it's as in my role as, say, a tech policy advocate or in other areas, we need to be critical of our interventions, right? Like, if we're going to suggest, like, we need to go take this route, design needs to move this route, we need to be both in conversation with folks who are impacted by these issues, right? But also are aware of the ways in which these interventions might, like, reify other, problematic practices, right? Like, if disclosing HIV on Grindr means the state's going to know about it, or they're selling this to third-party advertisers and I'm denied insurance or denied a particular rate, right? These are things that people are thinking about. These are things that users are thinking about or having to navigate on a daily basis. And we sort of hope to sort of recenter that and be, critical how we think about platforms, right? Because it's, I don't know, some people might not think that dating apps are, important things. As we have sort of written, there are both a host of individual and structural outcomes that are shaped by how it is we interact in sort of digital intimate spaces. And I think it's important that we attune to the folks who, like living with HIV is not fun in the dating world, right? That is not a fun experience, right? That is an experience filled with stigma, with hatred, with discrimination, with other forms of rejection that, like, especially in a sphere of intimacy, is, like, deeply, takes a toll on your own sense of self-respect and self-worth, right? But on top of all of that, you also have the state, right? You also have these other violent infrastructures, right, that you are now having to navigate on top of, just having HIV while existing in online dating, right? And I think we have to think about each of those layers, right? Because even some of this work that might not necessarily attend to those infrastructures are trying to get towards, like, how can people with HIV live with dignity and exist in, like, digital intimate spaces? And I think there's important work, and we are not the first ones to suggest, designing for these sort of pro-social ends, right? There are folks who have done really important work around HIV disclosure and dating platforms, and we have to credit them as well. We just want to continue to sort of not only, like, push that design space to think more critically, but also make sure that as, a community of social computing researchers, if we listen to advocates and we listen to communities, they want to decriminalize HIV, right? They want to remove these sorts of statutes and otherwise think more critically about HIV surveillance. And I think our community has, as a group of, social computing researchers, as folks who might work in tech policy, we need to be critical of the sort of infrastructures in place that shape and inform not only our research, but, the platforms we're thinking about.
I think, I would echo much of that. I think that Jevan is also getting at, like, or at least alluding to indirectly, one of, as I understand it, the core questions that you tend to ask people, which is, so how do you think about radicalism? And the way Jevan keeps talking about, like, what it means to be radical or what it means to be critical, one of the things that I think this work tries to do, and one of the reasons that it's important, and also one of the things that makes it, like, big C critical, is people think that being critical means showing up and saying, no, that thing's wrong, you're bad, go away. And my joke a lot of the time is that practitioners dislike critical scholars for the same reason that surgeons dislike coroners. As far as they're concerned, we're the ones who show up explaining how they killed their patients. And that never makes you popular. And also, it's really tempting to blame you because you're the one who keeps showing up with the death certificates. They were perfectly fine until you showed up. But what it means to do critical work is not to say that like this thing is bad, right? Like maybe there is a good way of developing like disclosure-oriented like efforts to address like HIV and transmission on social media platforms. Like maybe there are safe ways of doing it. But what we mean when we say critical is to sort of take a step back and examine the assumptions that are shaping like the choices we make, the options we see as available to us. So in this case going, hey, like you're thinking about this as a like two-actor problem, right? Of like, there's the person you disclose to, and then there's the person disclosing, and there's the interplay between them. But there are a lot of other factors which exist, which you're not thinking of, and you should really, take them into account. And this aligns a lot with radicalism, where radicalism is in some ways built around like questioning why, not necessarily saying like we must do X, but asking why we think that X is what we should do, and trying to almost like check our working and make sure that like X is actually the best outcome and not just the best outcome we can think of if we leave all of our other assumptions intact rather.
Yeah, and so I very much came to this project as like kind of a critical design researcher, but then also, I guess you could say, an expert user of these apps. I think to your point about the AI community not necessarily thinking about these things or this space, I think related to design and design choices, like I think it's important to recognize that these choices have, a range of consequences for real consequences for real people. I think Jevan just outlined a few of his personal experiences, but to really just emphasize that, like, design choices affect people's lives in like real ways, and sometimes in harmful and in like difficult ways. And so to kind of highlight that for people who are making these decisions, I think was also a really important aspect of this paper.
And so for folks who may not be very familiar with the current issues that are at stake here when it comes to AIV and the stigmatization, could someone speak a little bit about the current power imbalances that exist when it comes to HIV outside of digital technology, and then how dating apps might exacerbate some of those power imbalances?
Yeah, I mean, like you could think about, at least to start, like the disproportionate balance between information and power and the state, right? When you're diagnosed with HIV, in many jurisdictions, and say for my jurisdiction, like immediately that information is sent to the public health office. Immediately you are then contacted by, say, a contact tracing worker, which we've heard about in these various contexts around COVID. But this contact tracing person from the public health office will quite literally come to you, and you have to document every last person that you had slept with in a given period of time, say a year, right, to describe in detail what those sexual encounters were like, right? Where did you ejaculate? Like, how many people were there? What time of day? Like these sorts of things. And then you collect all of that contact information, and they tell you either you can call these folks and tell them that they need to get tested, or we will anonymously, right? And that's just one sort of imbalance where you have a person, right, who's now been diagnosed with a disease that carries its own history, right? Like my mother lost most, if not all, of her friends, all of her gay friends when she was my age, right, to this, right? Like you already have a person in a vulnerable position. You then have the state extracting all of this information. And as someone, who's a soon to be privacy attorney, I'm reading all of those things, right? Like I'm able to go through and be like, look, like I know when the state has this, what the state can use it it for, what exemptions the state could use, right? Because the state can say, for national security reasons, take my HIV data and otherwise do what it wants, right? And that's just like an individual micro level where the state has all this power, all this information, because you are a public health risk, right? And where that information exists, I'm not sure, right? Like I cannot tell you where that list still sits. Like this was in New York when I was diagnosed. I don't know who has access to that, right? But then when we think about, to platforms, right? You have sort of this imbalance where it's like, look, if you disclose it, it's public, right? Like it's effectively public on the platform. We're not going to take any sort of responsibility for your information. You disclose it, right? Which is itself a similar sort of imbalance where I am this sort of risky, vulnerable actor that is having to sort of carry the weight, right? Not only carrying the weight of the condition and the stigma that comes with it, right? But having some degree of power or attempting to understand where my information lives, what it can do to me. But for most people who live with HIV, you're not a critical data scholar or a privacy lawyer, right? Who might have, say, the sort of incumbent tools to even have a sense of that. But even with those tools, you're still powerless, right? Not only to the private organizations that might hold this information, right? But to the state that has this information and can use it for a variety of reasons, right? And we're just talking about the context right now of the United States, right? Like HIV is a global issue, and there are global regimes of surveillance, global regimes of incarceration that this plays into, right? That you already have a fairly, powerless, at least individual in my sort of experience, and then you have, the state and private platforms having, the control over where that information can go, right? So that's just maybe a little bit of the imbalances, but there are plenty. I mean, we can think about particular imbalances, like the sort of like racialized imbalances, right? The ways in which HIV has particularly struck, communities of color, and the ways in which the state's sort of a carceral arm has particularly targeted those communities for HIV surveillance and sort of downstream prosecution and incarceration, right? Like it's not necessarily white gays in New York City, right, who are being arrested by the police for HIV, right? That's not to discount that. There are hosts of ways in which the NYPD have played out against people in New York, but there are power balances in the way in which HIV impacts people, and particularly HIV surveillance and criminalization. It's like, I mean, for a lot of folks don't even realize that, like Guantanamo Bay, right, its entire inception was for HIV positive Haitian migrants, right? Like so many parts of our own history are built up the ways in which we have excluded people with HIV, particularly, persons of color and foreign folks with HIV. And it's only until recently, right, like the Obama administration, where some of these immigration-related HIV protocols, right, were sort of dismantled, right? And that sort of goes again into the sort of power imbalance we're thinking about, where HIV is not only a viral vector, but it's a vector of state power, right? A way in which the state can decide where you can go, who you are, who you can talk to, who you can engage with, right? Where you can travel to, right? And in many ways, folks with HIV don't necessarily have the autonomy or the agency to combat that, right, without facing, repercussions either from the state or, just from regular people, right?
Yeah. The only two small things I guess I would add to that is first, I think it's worth highlighting the way that these inequalities can play out in practice is not just because of the sort of mandatory, like, diagnosis reporting link, but also because of how heavily that's wedded to access to treatment. Like if you want access to retroviral meds, then you have to have a diagnosis. They don't just hand them out in the street. Correspondingly, like that process of sort of contact tracing is basically inescapable if you want to not just die. Foucault's concept of like biopolitics is like very applicable. We give you the right to live, assuming that you do everything exactly the way that you want. And this can particularly difficultly play out, when other aspects of criminalization come into it. So for example, we know that there is a disproportionate sort of infection rate and epidemic in like trans communities, particularly for trans women of color. And I often think when they're talking about sort of contact tracing and everything else, if you are someone who is, structurally screwed with to the point where you are dependent on things like sex work for like life, or if you are someone who didn't pick it up through sex at all, who picked it up through, intravenous drug use, so on and so forth. Like if the way in which you came to be infected, or the way in which you might prove a vector for other people is itself criminalized, irrespective of HIV. How do you disclose that? Like, how do you, as a sex worker, walk into a clinic with a random doctor where the very premise of the interview is that they are legally obliged to pass on some of its contents to the government and to hell with what you want, and say, well, I'm a sex worker and I'm doing this thing which is illegal, and here are all of the people I've done it with, and here are all of the people who have, you know, commissioned sex work and so have also committed a crime. You know, this very much rolls downhill, and even this phenomenon of sort of widespread contact tracing, like, just to contextualize it, the thing it always reminds me of is in the UK, so there are different security clearances. I used to be friends with a couple of fancy civil servants, which is the only reason I know this. And the highest one, the one you need to pass to get access to top secret material, is called developed vetting. And it involves, amongst other things, an interviewer tracing your previous sexual contacts to, well, work out if any of them are Russian spies. For someone to gain access to, like, retrovirals, we require them to undergo an equivalent amount of contact tracing and vetting and interrogation about their private life that we do to give them access to top secret classified government material, just by default. And that's fundamentally ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think about power imbalances kind of on two levels. The first is like a platform level. I think the perhaps like easy kind of counter to our argument is like, just don't disclose your status on these platforms. And I think to that, I'd say there's this actually like really unfair pressure to disclose your status, because often you have to like offer up that information in order to kind of unlock like a wider range of sexual and romantic experiences and potential partners. There's this great kind of concept that I think about a lot called privacy unraveling. This is work done by like Mark Warner and others. But here they talk about how, like, by not disclosing, you know, from an individual not disclosing in like a sea of other people disclosing their statuses, there are assumptions made about you just by not saying anything. And so I think in this example, we can see that, like, regardless of what you do, people are going to base judgments off of you or base judgments on you. And so there's this really unfair, like, pressure to just give this information to the platform. I also think about it from an individual level, just thinking about how disclosing your HIV status on these apps, like, you're very much trusting another person, this person that you're sharing this information with, I don't know, not to harm you or use this information against you in any way. And so there's also this imbalance, you know, when you're kind of giving this information out, just because I'd say a majority of dating apps also incorporate location tracking, and, you know, Grindr will tell you the distance between you and another person down to, like, you know, feet, like a really kind of small measurement of. And so thinking about just like personal experiences of, like, do I feel safe right now with this person knowing how far I am from them? There's also that kind of like power imbalance in terms of individual to individual. Yeah.
I think it's, I don't know how many of my friends who are actively using dating apps actually know what data is being tracked and kept and where it's going. So for folks who may be surprised at some of what you all are talking about, could you just give kind of like a dating app 101? Like, what is Grindr or Tinder? Like, what are they looking at? What are they keeping? Where is that going? And again, that kind of like, why does that matter element. Oh, also how does that connect to the state? As the other part of this is like, how is that information, that data that they're collecting, getting to the state? Is it being sold off, kind of, et cetera?
Yeah, so I mean, I can't give you like the full broad brush in that dating apps have a variety of different policies, and as we sort of analyze, most that for a number that allow HIV disclosure, only a few actually have HIV specific policies, and most of them tend to be either one, like your information is effectively public. So once it's disclosed on the platform, right, anyone who comes to your account and sees it, it's theirs, right? We don't protect against that. Grindr recently released sort of a statement on third-party data sharing with respect to HIV data. There were multiple controversies where Grindr's sort of third-party data was being sold to advertisers. There were some issues where there were HIV researchers who were wanting access to that data. But generally speaking, like anything that's in your profile in terms of dating platforms is considered public information. It's as if I wrote it on a sign and then walked out in public. That's how the dating app sort of views the information you're disclosing. Right, they have the ability, right, to be more protective, to create other sorts of protective regimes. But generally speaking, there aren't massive prohibitions on sharing with third parties. I think we look specifically on like HIV specific disclosures. Not many apps that even allow HIV disclosure address HIV specifically, so it sort of falls into their sort of general, sort of platform policies. And how it relates to the state is a few different ways, right? Like one, like the state can get access to third party data through private companies, right? Second, the state can directly partner with the platform, right, to attempt to get this information for research, which we've seen, sort of spurred a controversy with Grindr, where we had HIV researchers from a state university wanting to access that information. Obviously, not super in accordance with user expectations around the use of that data, right? But the state is able to use platforms, whether in sort of by contract, right, and actually engaging the platforms themselves, right, by accessing third-party data, and also like the state can use platforms in ways that are actually, against the platform's interests, right? We talk about the ways in which law enforcement have used platforms to actually investigate, right? Whether that's talking to people on platforms, whether for drug busts or for HIV. There have been really great reporting on the Egyptian state forces using Grindr to entrap and sort of ensnare, sexual minorities for breaking various, laws around homosexuality and other issues. So there's ways in which the state can engage both directly with a platform, with third-party sorts of folks, as well as sort of using the platform against, say, maybe its terms of service, even if that's not squarely sort of prohibited. But generally speaking, dating apps, and we sort of conclude as well, aren't doing enough. Right, like if we're going to think critically about designing for HIV, there has to be a component of how we protect HIV information, not only from other users on the platform, right, but from third-party individuals as well as the state, right? I mean, that's a political judgment on the part of the platform, but I think if platforms are serious about social justice and intimacy, which according to some platforms' marketing materials they are, right, it requires a critical relationship, right, to these sort of external forces, even if they are public health authorities, right? And I think that's a part of our work as well, is like we can't assume that public health is just this overriding good in all instances that justify, the creation of these arms to like, well, let's just give the state the data because it's just public health, right? Because public health surveillance has resulted in a variety of different forms of harm, right? But in too many ways, we sort of make hygienic or sort of clinicize this sort of notion of if it's public health surveillance, we don't hold it in the same ring when we think about other forms of invasive surveillance, right?
I mean, I guess I would just say, like, I agree with everything that Jevan said. And I also think that there is a interesting there's an interesting contrast here with this data and with like the Grindr reaction, and then with things like the Snowden leaks a few years ago, So minor anecdote, Wikipedia ended up suing the NSA over intercepting people's Wikipedia sort of browsing. And I was actually the researcher and like data analyst who put together all of the information for that brief, which was really interesting because occasionally I wake up and then remember that I sued the NSA once and then promptly forget, because that's a big thing to think about. But I think it's interesting to compare that to this. Like it turns out that the US government is tracking what you look up on Wikipedia, and instantly a top 10 website is at the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, like yelling at the US government. There is legislation introduced, there are Senate hearings, there are New York Times front pages. It gets to the point where the US government has to pass a law retroactively saying that what the NSA did was legal, which is basically as close as the US government gets to fixing something. Is saying, okay, not saying, okay, that's fucked up, so we're going to stop, but saying that's fucked up. Oh, wait, no, it's not. Take backseas. No, it's fine. Whereas when you look at like the Grindr sale to China, or look at like the general HIV like surveillance infrastructure, in the case of the Grindr sale, like let's be honest, at least 50% of the reason that it got any media coverage whatsoever was like the massive xenophobia that's currently going around, particularly in terms of like government relations. Like the Chinese government can't be trusted with this data, but we can. But more generally, like I don't see any laws being introduced about this data collection or setting minimum standards. I don't see any corporations going to court to push off the gag orders that are on top of the like user data requests to get this data out. Like there's a lot fewer eyeballs on it and there's a lot less effort. And I can't help but feel that a big part of it is because first it's seen as in some ways like naturalized, like the public health infrastructure and the idea of like HIV surveillance is older than the Patriot Act. But second, because like HIV is that disease for queers. Like that's how it's seen, that's how it's treated. And Google has like an organization that cares enough about, tonguing right-wing ring pieces that it appoints the CEO of the Heritage Foundation to its ethics board to make like Newt Gingrich happy, has very little to zero incentive to like go toe-to-toe with the US government on the front page of the New York Times and in court for the sake of queer people. Like, and this, but this just, the thing that sort of gets at me the most though is that this disparity is, also makes itself apparent in where we put attention as researchers and also as just like people who can have the ability to phone up their Congress critters and yell at them for not doing things. And that is a thing I would like to see a hell of a lot more of, is not just people looking at our paper and going like, gee, tech companies should be more self-aware, but also being like, when you found the time to yell at the government for these 15 things, but you were nowhere to be seen on the gay blood ban, which persists, or HIV-related restrictions in immigration, or the constant naturalization of surveillance. And everyone should read Stephen Muldrum's next paper, which gets at some of the really, really terrifying ways that this is being expanded right now. It does make me want to yell at more than just Grindr and the US government, but also yell at my colleagues.
Yeah, and I'd also say I worry that a reaction to this paper and our kind of concerns around state surveillance is that people would say, like, this is all conjecture, like you're all just like making up a problem that doesn't exist. And I think it's important to just recognize that the fact that like just a handful of companies own kind of all the dating apps you can think of, thinking about how there's just this, I guess, database of really personalized, sensitive information, just in many cases unprotected. And then thinking also about the history of criminalization of HIV and to be gay or queer in the US or in the world. I think that those things kind of combined cause a lot of concern for these communities, and it should be a bigger concern for everyone overall. And so, yeah, I guess I just bring this up to say, like, we're not just like blowing whistles for the sake of it, right? It's like we're trying to make everyone aware of this thing that is potentially very dangerous for everyone.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of the specifics then, so we can get to some action items here for not only the listeners, but people at tech companies, people in policy. So in your paper, you analyzed 49 dating apps and platforms. That's a lot, so you probably learned quite a bit, I'm sure. I'm curious if you can explain some of the questions that you asked about the design practices in terms of prevention, stigma reduction, policies, and then also how those questions can help inform us to build better design practices to help with this destigmatization and this HIV prevention in general.
Yep, happy to chat about that. So we asked sort of a variety of questions when we sort of approached each of the platforms, right? Squarely around like one, like does the platform allow you to disclose HIV status, sort of what those options look like, what those disclosures look like, whether there were disclosures around sort of quote unquote safer sex practices, questions around whether or not you could search, sort, or filter based on HIV status or based on sort of like HIV related information, like on say, you can indicate on some platforms that you're on PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. I see those sorts of questions. We also ask questions around like, is HIV expressly mentioned in your policy, right? Like what are, the policies protecting this information? Is it explicit? Trying to take it from more of a lay user perspective. It's like, cool, if I'm going to a privacy policy, is there HIV in it? No, for the most part. And happy to, tag to Calvin as well onto other sort of variety of questions we sort of approach all these platforms sort of documenting. And in large part, I think part of it as well is a lot of these interventions around HIV have been limited to sort of gay platforms, right? There's the sort of overriding stereotype that like HIV is a sort of a gay man's problem. It's also a problem for communities of color and women and other people, right? And I think part of our study as well is like, cool, like there's some intervention to get a sense of what about the other platforms? Like what's Tinder doing, right? What's Bumble doing, right? What are these other platforms that we consider to be either generic or otherwise large scale dating platforms? And for the most part, not doing anything. Right, like there aren't, as you'll see in sort of one of the charts we have in the paper, is for the most part, platforms aren't designing for HIV, right? They're not designing for HIV disclosure. They're not designing in their policies for it. There is little to no attention that HIV exists, right? Which in some of those sort of reinforcements that we think about, it's like, cool, if all of this intervention is happening on gay platforms, nothing's happening on straight platforms, how might this like reify certain assumptions around who HIV is a problem for, right? Who the user with HIV is, right? Which in itself is a problem, right? In that these other platforms have ways in which they could engage or otherwise help users who have HIV. Like there are women who live with HIV, there are straight people who live with HIV, right? And so there's sorts of like overarching sorts of things we think about, and happy if Calvin and other folks want to jump in on that as well.
I wouldn't add too much other than saying, two large categories that we looked for were the design features and then the policies, right? And so like you can learn a lot from both of these things, and kind of, I wanted to maybe put some numbers to what Jevan was saying. And so like, we looked at 49 apps and like only 8 of them mentioned HIV in their policies. And 5 of those 8 were queer specific. And honestly, more specifically geared for gay men. And then 3 more generalized apps were the ones that mentioned HIV in their policies. That's really scary to me. The fact that I guess just a majority of apps aren't, confronting HIV in their policies and protecting their users in that way.
And on that as well, we also tracked, and it was to sort of, narrow within like the broader scope of platforms, is not only just HIV disclosure, like are there affirmative efforts to destigmatize, right? Like what other sort of information is provided around HIV, whether that's attempts to sort of normalize or destigmatize the condition, disclosures around the condition, as well as information like sexual health info, like where can I get tested? What does it mean to have HIV? What does it mean to be HIV undetectable, right? Information that could otherwise, help folks navigate their own condition, their friends' conditions, or just navigating the intimate space around HIV. And sort of to Calvin's point as well, for the most part, it's not happening, right? For the most part, it's limited, right, to more to platforms targeted towards gay men. I think some cool design features that we sort of uncover and talk about a little bit. One of my favorite, I just love writing Daddy Hunt in papers, but they have a stigma-free pledge, right, where instead of allowing users to disclose their condition, right, to put the onus on the user to put their information out into the world, they sort of reverse it and say like, cool, are you comfortable interacting with, dating, or otherwise, sexually engaging with someone who has HIV, right? And then you get quite literally a little badge on your profile. I forget if it's a star or whatnot, and it's your stigma-free pledge, right? And what we sort of like about this feature, and I think is a positive development, is like, cool, right? Instead of asking an individual with HIV to disclose, to put that information out there, to render themselves vulnerable to the harms of all of the folks who are on the platform, the state, private industry, right? Now individuals can create a marker that's like, cool, like I'm not going to like brutally attack you when you disclose your HIV status to me in person, right? Or I'm not going to like reject you in horrible ways, right? Based on you disclosing it in a chat, right? It allows you as a user to like, cool, I have to navigate the stigma. I have to navigate all of these other sorts of things around my status. Now I can be like, cool, like I can readily point out at least 5 people in say a square mile from my house who like aren't going to hate me because I have HIV, right? Or who like maybe might have the language or the toolkit to just at least talk to me about it, right? And so we also, besides disclosure, we consider these sort of other destigmatizing efforts, and think that that's a part of it as well, right? That information provided in other sorts of design markers can be a more creative way to allow folks with HIV to sort of live with dignity or otherwise navigate easier, right? It's not necessarily we've solved HIV by having stigma-free badges, right? But still, I think has a big impact for users, right? Particularly if they're trying to find someone without having to do the legwork of, okay, I'm going to talk to this person. Now I need to make sure they have some degree of like progressive understanding about how HIV works and that it's not going to, a host of things. So.
Yeah, one of the things that we most appreciated about the paper is that it had this interdisciplinary focus to it. And also for you all as a team, we were coming from different backgrounds, from a law background, from a design background. And as we look towards closing, the last thing that I really appreciated about your paper was that it seemed like you had some clear design ideas and possibly also legal ideas about what to do about some of these issues and how to address them both in an interdisciplinary lens and then also in a comprehensive lens. And I'm thinking specifically in your abstract, you point to bottom-up, communal, and queer approaches to design as a way of potentially making that tension easier to navigate, but also it seems like to address some of these deeper concerns. And I'm wondering if you could say more about what those ways might be.
I mean, I guess like more perhaps tangible design recommendations that we put forth are kind of, just being more explicit, the platform being more explicit about what they're doing with the user's data, giving the user a little bit more agency in what happens with that, and kind of in the deletion process and like the storage of this information, kind of making it clear in their policies that they're not going to hold on to that forever, and like what they'll do with that information.
Great. And to finish out this panel and this discussion, it would be wonderful if all of you could provide just one last comment or maybe a piece of advice or just something that embodies some of your biggest takeaways from this project.
Sure, I'll start. I think my 2 sentences or sort of my sum up is one, decriminalize HIV. Like we shouldn't be criminalizing our way out of a pandemic. I think we were learning this with COVID, and I think we've learned this time and time again, is that we're not going to solve the HIV crisis with cops. I think on 2 other levels, right? Public health surveillance is not an overriding good. We need to be more creative in the ways in which we sort of build public health surveillance infrastructure. And then sort of my last, and I know this is more than 2 sentences, but design has to attend for law, policy, and history. Like we can't be out suggesting how we're going to design the world if we don't attend to the ways in which the world has fundamentally oppressed, subjugated, and otherwise, sort of marginalized a variety of folks and people. Critical technical practice is good. Work interdisciplinarily, it's great. And Calvin and Os are awesome. And I don't know, it's been a treat working with them. And I think also just unpacking a lot of the personal stuff in this, like just to live this and then to write about it, I think is cathartic in some ways, to be able to share that experience, but also to attempt to unpack it further, right? Like this isn't the panacea. We have not solved everything. This is the beginning of a conversation that we hope to support and hope other folks can sort of take and run with and, disarm information and power from the state when possible.
I would 100% agree that like Calvin and Jevan are awesome. This was one of those cases where truly like the friends you make along the way are the ones you need. Although like I was already friends with both of them, although I still can't work out how I know Calvin unless I just like ran into Calvin at like visit days and both of us were like, oh, you look super gay, let's be friends. I guess my other main takeaway though would be to echo what Jevan was saying about like factoring in the state and factoring in history, and to sort of like redouble and re-emphasize it. Stop just working with the state and assuming that that is the same as it being good. And in fact, this is like a very specific, like almost subtweet. If you do a paper about how you are collaborating with cops on developing new software for tracking sex trafficking victims. And you state that you personally refuse to take an opinion on whether sex work is moral or not, and also that the cops pinky promised that they wouldn't use the software to track down voluntary sex workers, and so you believe them because they are cops. You are a bad person and also an idiot. You should not trust cops. If you are going to trust cops, you should not have a place in our discipline. And if this is bewildering to people who are listening, I would really, really recommend reading Our Enemies in Blue, which is a fantastic book, currently 50% off through Verso and AK Press, on the long history of why the police are not your friends.
I'm going to take a different spin on this. I think speaking to designers and technologists and builders, right, I think it's important to just recognize that design has a lot of power, and it's really easy to, I guess, invalidate this work and the things that we're kind of challenging here. But like, I just so strongly believe that like design has the ability to reproduce social norms, but then it also has the ability to challenge reality and like reshape how we think about HIV or dating or, you know, whatever. And so I guess, yeah, like tacked on to Os's point, like designers just have this responsibility to factor in the law and like histories of oppression into these design decisions, because ultimately they have these real lived experience related consequences for people. And I think it's I guess easy to forget that design kind of has individual effects on people. So don't forget that, I guess I'd say.
We want to thank you all so much for the work that you all are doing, and we'll make sure to link to the paper and also to your Twitter or wherever people can follow your individual research or collective research in the future. And again, just thank you so much for joining us today.
We want to thank Calvin, Jevan, and Os again for joining us today for this great conversation and our first panel, with a special thanks to First Monday for publishing their article and Kate and Mara for editing the HIV and AIDS edition of the publication. So, Dylan, what is your immediate reaction from this panel?
I was really grateful for the vulnerability and the openness and honesty that everyone on the panel showed up with. I thought it was a really down-to-earth conversation about why this matters and why design choices matter in how we design our technology, even when it comes to something like dating apps. And Jess, I don't know if you've been on dating apps recently. You don't have to disclose. But in my experience, I would never think about the massive amounts of data that is being collected and like where that's going. And then you take into account, you know, this topic of sexual health and HIV and AIDS, and there are just so many topics that I feel like are not discussed in the same way that they should be when we talk about technology design.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, Dylan, this is something that keeps coming up again and again in our interviews and on this show, is the different systems of power and how technology plays into those systems of power. And so I'm going to add one more thing to that list of something that is synonymous with power, and that is design decisions. And just like you were saying before, I mean, the people who create these platforms, they probably aren't thinking through the possible unintended consequences or the potential surveillance and incarceration and biopolitics of something as simple as adding a checkbox to a dating app profile. But those decisions have important consequences, and those design decisions really matter.
Yeah, since this conversation, I've been reflecting on concepts of stigma in technology. And there was something from this conversation that really stuck with me about this idea of public health and like the idea of like the common good for public health, especially while like we're recording this during the pandemic, and how often that concept of like, well, this is for the public health gets used to design technology. And when I think it was Jevan who was talking about like all the different ways in which that gets used against people with HIV, that you're constantly reminded that you're not for the public good, that you're not for the public health, and you get put in this box and you have to just like constantly disclose and constantly, come out as being HIV positive, and just how complex all of that is in terms of stigma and how you design to be liberative for folks who are impacted by HIV and not just create more cycles of shame and oppression.
Yeah, this was even something that Charlton said in our most recent episode with All Tech is Human, when he was talking about, there's different roles that computing technology can play in our lives, and it's up to us to decide if we want that role to be harmful, if we want to use technology to help out with systematic oppression and to help create things like a surveillance state and only use it to benefit large tech companies and government bodies. Or we can choose to flip the narrative, and we can create technologies that empower and like you were just saying, liberate and help and create positive benefits for society. And this is a perfect example of how to maybe go about doing that in a scenario that you might not even think about normally.
So for more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, we invite you to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And as always, stay radical.
Stay radical. Radical. Stay radical.
You want to say it again?
Stay radical. Stay radical. It's pretty good. That one will stick, I think.
I have no comment.